When I was 18, my older brother and some of his friends spent a week in the woods. We got a cabin off Airbnb that was in a pretty remote spot. It was summer and we were all off from school at the time. I had just finished high school, and I would be going to college in the fall. My brother and his friends were going into their last year of college. The cabin was a small one-story building, and there was a decent porch at the front. It had a couple of rocking chairs lined up next to the door. The place was quaint, and with those chairs I could imagine an old couple sitting there. Other than that, it was surrounded by forest, and the nearest neighbor was far away. My brother's friend Cam was driving, so he picked everyone up since we were all in the same city. He had a small SUV that we thought would be good for the rougher roads. As it turned out, the weather was pretty smooth, and we would have probably been fine with a normal car. It was about a 5-hour drive once we got out of the city. Mostly on paved highways, but the last hour or so was on dirt roads. They were fairly well kept, and it was pretty easy. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, unpacked our stuff, and settled in quickly. There was a single bedroom, but there was also a pull-out couch. I brought my camping pad so I could sleep on the floor. The first day was mostly spent exploring the area, hiking along the trails, and talking to the guys. My brother and I walked down one of the trails for a good hour and a half, and we ended up really far away. We found a road that looked pretty old, but it did have some fresh tire tracks on it. We were a little confused because it didn't show up on the map, but maybe Google wouldn't put it on there if it were abandoned. Either way, we knew somebody was using it, so there must have been another person around. We didn't see him though, and eventually we went back to join the others. On that first night, we built a campfire in the pit that was around the back of the cabin. I had never been much of an outdoors person, so this was actually kind of exciting for me. The sky was clear, and I could see more stars than I had ever seen before. It was a great night, but also a bit ominous with the sounds of the forest around us. We could hear the occasional rustling in the bushes and the distant call of an owl. After a while, we went inside, locked the doors, and settled in for the night. It was past midnight by then. The next day was more of the same. Some of the guys wanted to check out the lake that was nearby, so we did that, and then had another fire. That night, after we went to bed, I heard strange noises outside. I was camped out on the floor next to the back window, and I could hear a faint rustling. It wasn't that obvious, but I knew the sound of the wind, and it wasn't that. I was trying to ignore it, but then it grew louder, like something moving through the bushes. My brother was on the pull-out couch about 10 feet away, and he heard it too. He thought it was probably just a raccoon or a deer, but I was afraid that it was a bear. It seemed to be getting closer, though, as time went on. I think I was the only one still awake by then, because when I looked around the cabin, I could see that my brother was sleeping. I checked my phone for the time, and it was 2 in the morning. By then, there were very clear footsteps outside the cabin. I didn't know what a bear sounded like, so I couldn't be sure what it was just from the sound. I was curious, though, so I got up onto my knees and looked out the window, which was right above me. I could definitely see something out there, but it was dark, and it was tough to tell what it was. I thought it looked like a person, though. That seemed impossible, though, so I ignored it, thinking it was probably a bear. The next morning when we got up, I didn't say anything to anybody else. I was still curious, though, and I wanted to see if there were actually bear tracks out there. I decided to check around the cabin for any signs of animals. I went out and checked the ground right where I had seen it, but the only tracks I could find were shoes, all belonging to us, I assumed. That evening, we were having dinner inside. The 4 of us were sitting around the small round table next to the kitchen. It was not quite dark outside yet, but we knew it would be soon. We were planning to have another fire that night and have some beers, but just as we were finishing up, I looked out the window. I saw a figure emerge from the edge of the forest, slowly making his way towards the cabin. We all jumped up and looked out the window. It was a man who looked disheveled, and he walked with a limp. He stopped about 20 feet from the porch, just standing there staring at the cabin. Cam grabbed a flashlight, but he didn't turn it on, and he stepped out onto the porch. "Can we help you?" Cam called out. The man didn't respond, he just stood there staring at us. After what felt like forever, he turned around and walked back into the woods without saying a word. We watched until he disappeared into the darkness. Then we quickly locked all the doors and closed all the windows. None of us slept well that night, and we stayed up talking for most of the time. Nothing the man did was particularly scary or threatening, but it was really creepy, because what we saw the night before seemed like he was creeping around there for a while. That was actually what scared me the most. The next morning, we packed up our things and decided to leave. None of us wanted to stay another night after what happened. As we were driving, my brother messaged the owner of the property to let him know that we were leaving early, and told him why. I guess we were hoping for a refund for the extra days. The owner told us that nobody else should have been in the area, and that he would look into it. He did refund the extra days, but I'm not sure if he took it very seriously at all. We don't know if the guy was crazy, or if he was some kind of local to the area messing with us. But I was pretty scared when I saw him for the first time, especially because I think he was out there in the middle of the night before. If he was going to rob us, and I don't know why he would just walk up and stand there as he did. He could have broken in late at night when we were all asleep. We never got any real answers about what happened out there, and we probably never will. This happened a few summers ago, when I was visiting my parents. I had moved out for college 3 years prior, but I would still spend the summers there. It was 4 months, and at one point my parents went to visit my older brother in a different city. Because of that, I would be alone at the house. My parents also had a cottage that was about a 5-hour drive away. My parents bought it after I moved out, so I didn't know the place very well. I had only been there a few times and never alone before this. I asked my parents if I could go up there instead of staying at the house because that would be too boring. They agreed, so that's what I did. My parents left on a Saturday morning, and I left for the cabin that afternoon. There was still some daylight when I arrived, so I had time to hang out before bed. It was a pretty remote cabin, and it was mostly off-grid. Potable water was limited, and we still used the original outhouse that was built in the 1920s. The building had wood siding that made it look like a log cabin, even though it wasn't. There was a creaky wooden porch at the front that was in need of repair. There was a missing plank of wood off to the left. My dad was planning on doing some upgrades, including an upgrade to a septic system, but hadn't gotten around to it yet. It was accessible by car, and the last mile was just for our place, so there wouldn't have been any reason for anybody else to be there. That being said, the road was pretty good, as long as it didn't rain. The next day in the afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, and I heard a knock at the door. It was an absolute shock, because I didn't think anybody else was in the area, and the only people who knew I was there were my parents. Standing outside was a guy I didn't recognize. He looked a bit scruffy, but not overly threatening. I opened the door just a crack and asked him what he wanted. I thought he might be a neighbor, and I didn't want to be rude. If it were any later in the day, then I might not have been as welcoming, but it was around 2 in the afternoon, so I wasn't that scared. I opened the main door a little wider, but I left the screen door closed. As soon as I did, the man smiled at me and told me that he was lost and needed directions. Even though I thought it was weird, I told him how to get back to the main road, even though it was basically just a straight line. It would have been at least an hour on foot, though, so I didn't understand how he got all the way out here. While we were talking, I could see the man looking over my shoulder into the house. It was like he was checking the place out, which made me kind of uncomfortable. However, after we talked for less than 5 minutes, he turned around and walked away. He went down the only road that led out, and I watched until I couldn't see him anymore. Although I knew it all seemed weird, it wasn't enough to make a big deal over. Even though you couldn't rely on the cops out there, my dad had a gun in the bedroom for emergencies, and he even trained me on it the first time I went out to the cabin. So even though I didn't want it to come to that, I knew it was there just in case. Later that night, I was in the living room watching a VHS movie on the old TV. When it was almost over, I wanted to have a smoke. My parents wouldn't know if I did it inside, so there was a spot on the property that I usually used, just a small clearing with a pond next to it. I put on my shoes and went outside. It was around 10 at night, so it was dark. My flashlight was bright as I walked down the path in the woods. When I got to my spot, I lit up a smoke and put my flashlight down on the ground, pointing up. It was just enough that I could see a little. After a while, I heard rustling in the woods. I knew right away it was a person, and before I knew it, a man approached me, and it was the same guy who had come to my door earlier. I was about to say something to him, but before I could, he attacked me. The cigarette fell out of my mouth and landed on the ground next to my flashlight. As we struggled, I kicked over the light and it landed on its side, pointing away from us. It was almost pitch dark after that. The whole fight was basically a blur to me. I couldn't see much, I wasn't sure how badly I was getting beaten, and I didn't know if he had a weapon. Eventually, I managed to free myself, grabbed my flashlight from the ground, and I started running back to the cabin. I got there and went inside, not sure how far back the man was. Right then, I remembered the gun in the bedroom for emergencies. I reached the dresser, grabbed the gun, and turned to face the doorway. My hands were shaking, and I didn't even know if the gun was loaded. Once I stopped to listen, I could tell there was somebody in the house. I shouted out that I had a gun, but he didn't say anything. The footsteps were impossible to ignore, though, and they were getting closer. Then he appeared in the doorway. I was standing there shaking, with the gun pointed at him. The man froze when he saw me, and I shouted for him to leave. For a moment, it seemed like he might call my bluff. Then the guy took a step towards me. I yelled louder, telling him I would shoot if he didn't leave. This seemed to work, and the guy backed off towards the door, kept his eyes on me, and I kept the gun pointed at him. To be clear, I was nowhere near firing, but if he came at me, then I would have had to. He backed out slowly and went out the front door, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed where I was, still having the gun raised. My hands were still shaking, and I could barely breathe. I then put the gun down and collapsed onto the bed, trying to calm down. Less than a minute later, I got up and looked at the gun. That's when I realized that it wasn't even loaded. If I had a chance to think before, then I would have known that. After I got my bearings, I realized that I couldn't stay there, because he might come back. I grabbed my phone, wallet, and car keys, and I rushed out the back door, making sure to lock it behind me. I ran to my car and drove straight to my parents' house in the middle of the night. When I got home, I felt a bit safer, but my nerves were still on edge. I tried to sleep, but that wasn't happening, even though it was almost morning. I decided to call the police right then. I explained what happened and gave them the address of the cottage. They said they'd send an officer to check it out as soon as it was light. After hanging up, I called my parents. I didn't want to worry them while they were on vacation, but I thought they needed to know. My mom answered, and I quickly told her everything. She was understandably upset and said they would cut their vacation short to come home as soon as possible. I spent the next couple of hours pacing around the house, double-checking the locks and peering out the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man might have followed me or could still be lurking around somewhere. Eventually, I heard back from the police. That was when I found out that the cabin had been robbed. My parents didn't keep much out there, but the place was trashed. They also found evidence of a campsite nearby on the property. I told them that it wasn't ours because we just used the cabin. I think the guy was staying out there on the property, and when he found out that I was alone, he decided to make a move. When I went out to smoke, he must have seen my light and decided to take the opportunity. After that, he must have moved on out of fear of being caught. That thought did little to comfort me, though, and I never felt safe in that place again. When I was 12 years old, my dad decided that we should go on a summer vacation together. I was still in elementary school, but it was August, so I was off at the time. My dad was usually busy with work, but he would take his vacation when I was off from school so we could spend time together. When I was younger, I would stay inside playing video games as much as I possibly could, so my dad wanted to do something that would get me outside. That's why he rented a cabin in a remote area, hoping that would be a good way to get me away from the TV. It was just the two of us, and the idea of spending time in the wilderness was exciting. I wasn't mad about it or anything, because I liked spending time with my dad. We drove out to the cabin in my dad's work truck. He was a foreman for a construction company, and they let him use his truck whenever he wanted. It was basically like his personal vehicle. The truck was kind of a mess when we got in. He was pretty disorganized with work stuff, so there were all kinds of papers scattered everywhere. It was a long drive, so it took the better part of a day before we got there. We turned onto a dirt driveway leading up to the cabin. It was about 2 or 3 miles long, and I think it was private property for the cabin. On the way, though, we passed another truck. My dad waved out of courtesy, but I didn't see who was inside. We got to the cabin soon after. It was all right, but it was very isolated and surrounded by thick forest. It was small, but more than enough for the two of us. One thing that I do remember is that there was a loft where I got to sleep. It was small and a little cramped, but I thought it was cool at the time. My dad took the bedroom and I slept in the loft. Other than that, there wasn't anything special about the place. It had a small kitchen and a decent couch with just one real bedroom. On the first day, we just walked around and explored, mostly. I think my dad really wanted to teach me about the outdoors while we were out there. He had been an outdoor guide in the past, but I think his skills were kind of rusty. In the evening, we decided to have a fire, and he tried to use a fire bow to start it, but gave up and used a lighter instead. My dad seemed happy to be there, and so was I, even though I did miss my games a bit. That night, we cooked dinner over the fire and talked about various things. My dad told me stories about his own childhood, and I listened, feeling closer to him than I had in a long time. It was a good day, and it didn't seem long before it started to get late. Then we went inside, and I climbed up to the loft, while my dad stayed up reading a book on the couch. The loft was open to the rest of the cabin, so I could see my dad from above. He had just a small light on for reading, so it wasn't that bright for me. I was laying in bed, struggling to fall asleep, when I heard a knock on the front door. It was a soft sound, but it was impossible to ignore. I knew it wasn't the wind or anything. I looked down to my dad, and I could tell that he heard it too. He looked up from his book, his face suddenly serious. He stood up and walked quietly to the door. I watched him through half-closed eyes, pretending to be asleep. He didn't open the door or say anything, just stood there for a moment, listening. After a while, he turned off the light and returned to the couch, the book still in his hand. I eventually drifted off to sleep, and when I woke up in the morning, my dad was still on the couch, sleeping in the upright position. I climbed down from the loft and walked around the cabin for a few minutes, and I went over to wake up my dad. He immediately told me that we needed to leave. His face was tense, and I could tell that something was wrong. I asked him what was going on, but he told me not to worry about it. I thought it had something to do with whatever happened the night before. If there was some weirdo hanging around there, then it would make sense why we would leave. He quickly packed our things, not bothering to have breakfast. As soon as we stepped outside, I saw that the truck was completely trashed. The tires were all slashed, and the windows were shattered. What happened? I asked, but my dad just shook his head. He didn't seem to have an answer. He just told me to wait where I was. Then he went over to the truck. He came back with a handful of wrinkled papers. I assumed that was some kind of important stuff for work. I asked him if anything was missing, but he didn't answer. We had no choice but to walk back to the main road. The idea of walking all the way out in the woods made me nervous, but my dad was calm, which helped me to stay calm too. We began walking, sticking to the dirt driveway that led away from the cabin. It felt like a long walk, especially since I kept looking around, worried that whoever had destroyed the truck was still out there. My dad kept a fast pace, and I stayed close to him even though I was getting tired. After almost an hour, we reached the main road. I was exhausted, and my feet were sore. The sight of the paved highway was a relief. We stood there for a while, hoping a car would pass by. Eventually, a pickup truck approached, and my dad waved it down. The driver, an older man, stopped and asked if we needed help. My dad briefly explained our situation, and the man offered us a ride to the nearest town. The driver chatted with my dad during the ride, and I listened quietly. My dad didn't go into details about the night before, and I could tell he didn't want to talk about it in front of me. When we reached the town, the driver dropped us off at a diner so we could call for help. We thanked him profusely, and he wished us well before driving away. My dad called the police first, and then arranged for a tow truck to get us home. While we sat in the diner waiting, I finally asked my dad what happened. He looked at me with a serious expression and said he didn't know. He explained that he didn't hear anything after the knock on the door, but he may have fallen asleep at some point. After this whole thing was over, my dad and I never spoke about it again. There was a while where I thought we were targeted for some reason, like it had something to do with my dad's work documents. As I got older, I realized that didn't make any sense. He was an important guy at his job, but he wasn't the president or anything. I'm sure the papers weren't of any real value to anybody else. That attacker was probably just some crazy person or some drunk kids. We don't know for sure if it was the truck that we saw on the way in, but there weren't a lot of people around there, so that's what seems most likely to me. I'm a man, and this happened when I was 25. My sister Emily and I decided to go on a hiking trip together. We both enjoyed the outdoors and thought it would be a good way to spend a weekend together. We didn't live in the same city, but we were only about 2 hours away from each other, so it wasn't that hard to get together. We chose a well-known trail in the national forest a few hours away from my home. It was a Friday morning when we decided to go. Since her place was on the way for me, I decided to drive and pick her up on the way. By the time I left and got Emily, it was around noon, so it was still early in the day. As the city gave way to lush forests, I started to get excited about the weekend. We were going to spend 2 nights out there with no real schedule to follow. The trails out there are vast, and you could spend years exploring them without seeing it all. We were just going to wing it, though, and do whatever felt right. I was prepared with a map and GPS, though, so we weren't dumb or anything. We parked the car at the parking lot, which had a small building. I think it was some kind of information center, but it was empty, as it always was. The hike started off well. The weather was nice, and the forest was peaceful. For the first couple of hours, we were within the range of a day hike, so there were other people out there. There were families and old people getting in my way. We stopped occasionally to take pictures and talk. We kept going, and as the sun was setting, we eventually found a good spot to stop and camp for the night. The next day was more of the same. We got up early and covered a lot of ground. We chose a route that we hadn't taken before, and by midday the trail was all ours. It had been a good few hours since we had seen anybody else, and that was just what we wanted. After another couple hours, we decided to take a break and have a late lunch. We found a spot near a stream and sat down to eat. While we were resting, Emily noticed a small overgrown path leading from the trail. She was curious and suggested we check it out. I checked the map, but it wasn't there. I walked closer to take a look at the path, and it was clearly there, but was probably not used very much. Both of us were curious about where it led, so we packed up our stuff and started down the narrow path. The further we went, the more overgrown it got. Eventually, it felt like we were just walking through the woods without a path. Every once in a while, there would be a marker, so we weren't lost or anything. Emily was eager to keep exploring, so we continued. I wanted to keep going too. After about an hour on that path, we came across an old rundown shack hidden among the trees. There was a small clearing around the building, and when we stepped into it, the shack loomed over us. It looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. The windows were broken, and the roof sagged in some places. We walked around the outside for a while, and despite its dilapidated state, we noticed fresh tire tracks around. They stood out against the dirt and the leaves, making it clear that somebody had been there recently. That was a pretty big surprise because we thought we were out in the middle of nowhere. Somehow, we had stumbled upon an area with vehicle access that was so far away from civilization. The tire tracks were probably from an ATV, not a car truck, but it was still weird. We walked around the shack some more, peering inside the broken windows. There wasn't much to see, just old decaying furniture and debris. There definitely wasn't anybody living there, but the fresh tire tracks kept bothering me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something. In a way, that made it even more interesting. What could anybody possibly be doing with this place? It was far from livable. In fact, it was probably pretty dangerous to go inside at all. Despite that, we both wanted to check it out a little more, so we went in through the front door. The floors were soft because the wood was so rotten, and everything else was in rough shape too. The only thing that stood out was a large duffel bag that was stashed in the corner. It was the only thing in the room that didn't look old and rotten. I looked to Emily because she saw it too. It seemed obvious that somebody had stashed it there, so we knew we probably shouldn't have messed with it, but we were both curious. I walked over to it and Emily followed, and I bent down and unzipped it from the top. As soon as it was open, I knew we had to get out of there because the bag was filled with guns. I didn't take a closer look, and I zipped it back up right away. I told Emily to run. She didn't see what was in the bag, so she was confused for a minute. Then we left that shack behind. Once we got back into the woods, I was relieved, but still scared that somebody would come. After a while, we got back to the actual trail, and only then did we feel comfortable again. By then, it was getting dark, so we found a spot to camp out for the night. Even though it was creepy being out there, it was too late to hike out that day. We discussed it around the fire before bed. It seemed likely that the shack was being used by some criminals, and we were lucky that we didn't run into anyone. All night, I was scared that some criminal was going to come to us, because we weren't that far away from the cabin. In the morning, we hiked all the way out. It was our last day anyway. Emily and I were pretty freaked out the whole time, so we hiked out quickly and hardly stopped until we got back to the car. When we got close to the trailhead, there were the usual families and kids, but none of them knew what was going on in those woods. Of course, we did report what we saw out there. The police said that they would check out the cabin. When I heard back from them, they said there was nothing there. That could only mean that whoever put the bag there had come back for it. This story comes up between me and my sister every once in a while. We still get chills thinking about what we walked into that day. It was one of the scariest things that ever happened to us in the woods. We've seen bears and other animals, but even out there, the most dangerous thing is other people.